Chapter 1. The Shattered Silence. The Sterling Memorial Library loomed in the New Haven afternoon like a medieval fortress, its Gothic architecture a testament to centuries of knowledge. Yet today, its grandeur was shrouded in an unnerving silence, interrupted only by the echoing footsteps of students and faculty whispering behind cupped hands. Detective Lionel Graves stood at the library entrance, a chill running down his spine, despite the golden autumn light filtering through the towering windows. He was back at Yale, called upon by the university he once knew as a student. The distant scent of old paper and leather-bound books tugged at memories both fond and otherwise. But there was no time for nostalgia. His eyes fell on the yellow police tape cordoning off the rare books section, where Elara Montgomery, esteemed professor and a figure synonymous with Shakespearean scholarship, had been found dead. Graves tried to picture her in life-passionate eyes, sparking with intellect and ambition, a voice that could hold a lecture hall in thrall. Her demise had stunned the faculty, but as whispers turned to speculation, the murmurings of murder were impossible to ignore.
Detective Graves.
A voice broke through his thoughts. It was Officer Tina Lopez, a younger colleague from the New Haven department. Her expression was grim.
We've secured the area, but it's crowded. Press is already sniffing around.
Graves nodded. He'd have to move quickly before speculation morphed into wild rumor. Rumors she knew were dangerous, especially in a place where reputations were forged and destroyed on a whisper. As they maneuvered through the maze of aisles, ancient manuscripts casting motley shadows, Graves felt the air change. Here was the scene, the final chapter in Dr. Montgomery's life. Her body had been removed, but the coppery scent lingered, mingling with the mustiness of history. Scattered papers, her notes, perhaps lay in disarray. A chair was overturned, and a single light flickered above, casting ominous patterns across the floor.
"What do we know?"
Graves asked. Lopez handed him a packet containing preliminary findings.
She was onto something big, they said. Radical interpretations of Shakespeare, groundbreaking stuff. Her colleagues were both awed and threatened by it.
He scanned the pages, his mind racing.
"Any susts?"
Lopez shrugged.
More like motives abound. Dr. Adrian Sinclair, Montgomery's rival. There's Mona Carter, a grad student with everything to gain. And Simon Lang, the librarian, was the last to see her alive. Everyone's got secrets around here, Detective.
Graves absorbed this, sensing the labyrinth he would have to navigate. Sinclair's rivalry was infamous, academic cutthroat competition under a thin veneer of civility. Mona, ambitious and driven, desperate to step out of her mentor's shadow. As for Simon Lang, librarians were the gatekeepers of knowledge, often privy to the secrets that lurked within the books.
"The paper she was working on?"
Graves mused.
"I want to see it."
Perhaps fragments remain,
Lopez suggested.
if they haven't been taken.
Graves turned to face the library's depths, each shelf a silent witness to what transpired. He knew the pressure would be mounting. Yale needed this resolved, and the truth exhumed from beneath its prestigious facade.
"Let's find those fragments,"
Graves said, determination settling in his core.
"and see if Dr. Montgomery's voice speaks to us from the pages she left behind."
Detective Graves?
She asked hesitantly. Mona Carter stood there, a young woman with nervy energy, her hair a bit tousled, perhaps from the day's stress or some inner turmoil. She was carrying a stack of papers precariously, as if they formed a barrier between herself and the world.
"Miss Carter, please come in."
Graves replied, motioning her to enter. She did so, setting her papers on a nearby chair.
I know Dr. Montgomery's work well.
She began, her voice steady yet strained.
If you have questions, I'd like to help.
Graves studied her, aware of the pressures young academics faced.
"It's tragic what happened. Him trying to understand what Professor Montgomery's research might have unraveled."
She was on a brink, Detective, redefining narratives, but it made enemies. Some who couldn't care less about Shakespeare, but cared about the consequences.
He leaned forward, intrigued.
"Enemies, you say? Who might benefit from her findings never seeing the light of day?"
Mona hesitated, visibly torn between revealing truths and protecting the elusive academic ecosystem.
Many people. Dr. Sinclair was always skeptical, vocal about his disbelief. The administration, too. If her research was right, it could mean funding shifts, even program overhauls.
"And Simon Lang?"
Graves probed.
Do you think he might have had a part in this?
A shadow crossed her face, a flicker of fear.
Simon knows things? He's here after hours, always looking, watching.
Their conversation was cut short by another arrival. Dr. Adrian Sinclair swept into the room with an air of controlled arrogance, his expression an odd mix of anger and defensiveness.
I heard you were here, Detective Graves,
he said smoothly, ignoring Mona's presence.
I trust you'll be thorough. Elara and I often disagreed. I'd never wish her harm.
Still, disagreements can escalate, Graves replied, watching Sinclair for a reaction. Sinclair chuckled humorlessly. Graves noted the curious distance Sinclair put between himself and Montgomery's hypothesis. It felt rehearsed, like a line from a play. As Sinclair excused himself, with Mona following uncertainly, Graves sensed the undercurrents of Yale's prestigious facade rippling with hidden tensions. He returned to the corkboard, pinning together the disparate threads of intrigue. How much of this inter-academic jostling was simply part of the usual theatre of an Ivy League, and how much signalled something far darker? Graves knew he would have to peer beneath polite smiles and courteous nods, because beneath them lurked the whisper of secrets yet to be revealed. Chapter 3. Codes and Ciphers. Under the muted glow of the desk lamp, Detective Graves pored over Dr. Montgomery's notes well into the night. The skeletal branches of the ancient oak outside his window mirrored the threads of the investigation, twisted, dark, and bound to the winds. The manuscript titled The Tempest, A Hidden Language was not merely an academic exercise, but an intellectual pursuit that bordered on obsession. He couldn't deny the allure of her work, a scholar's chase, the promise of a hidden truth beneath the surface of Shakespeare's verses. It was a language wrought from cipher, metaphor, and history. Montgomery hypothesized that through an intricate system of allusions, Shakespeare embedded a dialogue on human nature and societal constructs far advanced for his time. Graves jotted notes, gradually realizing the magnitude of what she was attempting. She was unraveling knowledge like a tapestry. Once a single thread was pulled, the entire weave threatened to unravel. He couldn't help but wonder, was it this potential that had endangered her life? Fatigue crept into his bones as the clock neared midnight. Needing clarity, he decided to visit Simon Lang. The librarian was known to sleep only fitfully. Rumor had him prowling the library at all hours. An elusive character, Lang was said to have encyclopedic knowledge of the archives, and if anyone had glimpsed Montgomery's unfinished work, it would be him. The library was dimly lit when Graves entered, the smell of wax and wood polish mixing with the mustiness of ancient texts. Lang's office was a small, unassuming space tucked behind towering shelves. Books stacked everywhere, some perilously close to toppling. Lang himself sat behind a cluttered desk, his silhouette a study in angles and shadows.
You had questions, Detective?
Lang's voice was a whisper compared to the silence. Graves approached, sharp eyes scanning the librarian.
Dr. Montgomery, I'm trying to piece together her final work. Her research could have substantial implications.
Lang nodded slowly, the creases in his face deepening under the lamp's scrutiny.
Yes, Elara's work was transformative, but it threatened norms, the power structures we've taken for granted.
Graves edged closer.
Did she confide in you, share her theories?
Lang considered before digging into a drawer, pulling out a brittle piece of paper.
She did, but not all willingly. She was cautious, afraid perhaps.
The paper was covered in what appeared to be notes and codes, symbols Graves couldn't decipher offhand. He asked quietly,
What do these mean?
Lang met his gaze, intensity behind his spectacles.
Shakespeare's works are filled with allegory, cryptography. Elara believed he encoded critiques, histories that could destabilize cherished foundations.
He leaned back, eyes narrowed.
Her paper, if valid, was dangerous. For whom?
Graves pressed. A coldness descended upon Lang.
For those who prefer the status quo, the guardians of tradition, and among the students and faculty, everyone had their stakes.
Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. Detective Graves awoke the following morning with an unshakable urgency, driven by the spectre of Dr. Montgomery's unfinished work and the knowledge that danger lurked within Yale's sacred halls. The pieces of this jagged puzzle were beginning to align, but their clarity demanded deeper insights into those closest to the late professor. His next destination was the office of Dr. Adrian Sinclair. The gentleman scholar was respected and feared in equal measure. His charm could twist perceptions as effectively as his rhetoric swayed academic debates. Graves knew that Sinclair's relation to Montgomery hinged on a complex interplay of rivalry and mutual admiration. But could such dynamics spiral into real-world retribution? Sinclair's office was a mirror of its occupant, orderly, contemporary, and understatedly elitist. Shelves brimmed with Shakespearean folios, dissections of texts that laid bare Shakespeare's mind, conquests he'd mastered. Sinclair strode in with his tailored confidence, a man unperturbed despite the encroaching shadows.
Detective Graves.
Sinclair wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes.
I imagine you're here about Elara's work. A tragedy, her loss.
Graves nodded, noting Sinclair's composure.
Her research was set to challenge conventions. What do you make of it?
Her assumptions were bold, radical. Sinclair's hands gesticulated with theatrical ease.
Yet unfounded, in my opinion. But this is academia, such debates, provocations, it fuels our work.
Graves sensed rehearsed candor.
Could these provocations have threatened someone enough to silence her?
Sinclair gazed out through his office window, past the autumnal splendor.
Academia breeds its own peculiar strains of enmity, Detective. The stakes, while intellectual, can inflame passion.
His gaze swung back to Graves.
But murder, no, that's a beast of another kingdom.
Graves pressed on.
You mentioned unfounded assumptions. You disagreed with her findings, clearly. Could her success have threatened yours?
Sinclair chuckled softly, a calculated sound.
Competitive, yes. Catastrophic, hardly. Her work operated in realms that I respected from afar.
Graves weighed Sinclair's words, picking at their undercurrent. Despite Sinclair's polished veneer, shadows of disquiet lingered like specters.
Did she confide in you, Dr. Sinclair, amidst your disagreements?
Graves inquired. Sinclair leaned back, fingers steepling thoughtfully.
Elara hinted at ideas she was developing, yes. Ironic, perhaps, as rivals we were closer to each other's ideas than many think.
As Graves left, he couldn't dismiss Sinclair's elusive nature. Beneath Oxford shirts and erudite discussion, sincerity and obfuscation danced a careful waltz.
Elara was headstrong, brilliant, a storm of conviction.
She began, her voice softened by age, yet imbued with authority.
Her work was more than a study, it was a crusade. She despised half-truths and cowards who gloried in mediocrity.
Graves listened, sensing the unspoken verdicts etched into memory.
Would Sinclair have been a coward in her eyes?
Adrian was pragmatic, always. He revered tradition. Elara didn't. This world was her stage, not her sanctuary.
She paused, the weight of remembrance settling in.
Elara posed dangerous questions. Not all can handle the answers.
Graves realized the profound isolation Montgomery must have felt. A truth-seeker, embedded within an ivory tower of shadows and secrets. With constancy came confidence, but with radical delineations came solitude and betrayal. Emerging from Thorpe's heavily curtained room, Graves felt a renewed determination. The paths of this investigation twisted through more than simple academic circles. It delved into legacies, human frailties, and unguarded vulnerabilities. Dr. Montgomery's legacy was both monumental and perilous. The key lay not only in dissecting her work, but also understanding the people it touched. Graves knew the time had come to confront assumptions and move further into Yale's depths, for each revelation drew him closer to the truth buried within these hallowed halls. Chapter 5. The Tempest Revealed. Night blanketed New Haven like a watchful sentinel as Graves prepared to confront Simon Lang once more. His suspicions about the librarian's knowledge of Montgomery's murder grew, fed by hints and whispers from the shadows. The chase had become visceral, Montgomery's radical interpretations tugging him deeper into Yale's underbelly. The library was a labyrinth even in daylight. Under the cover of dark, it was a shadowed expanse swathed in silence and intrigue. Amidst the rare books section, Simon Lang was there, as expected. His presence was spectral, but this time a nervous energy wound through his typically calm demeanor. He recognized Graves's approach and gestured him into a dimly lit alcove, the secluded air thick with ancient mythos.
Detective, I anticipated your return.
Lang began without preamble.
This matter is we're running out of time.
Graves sat, fixing Lang with a penetrating gaze.
Dr. Montgomery's inhibitors were no mystery to you. She was murdered for this hypothetical paper, wasn't she?
Lang sighed, a burdened release.
I feared as much. Her discoveries, the codes, some wanted them buried, zealot protectors of fabricated truths.
Lang laid out pages, fragments of Montgomery's final work. Graves marveled at the intricacy. a myriad of cross-references and esoteric designs etched within the text. This was no ordinary academic paper. It was a dance of knowledge and power.
This hidden language,
Lang continued,
redefines hierarchies, explodes their narratives, rewriting the past. Those in power do not take kindly to tectonic shifts. Who benefits from suppressing her work?
Graves pushed, urgency lacing his words. Lang hesitated, a profound weariness lining his features.
The answer, detective, is as layered as Shakespeare's metaphors. But know this, it's not just academics, it's the... No!
Graves lunged to aid Lang, but the life was already fleeing his eyes. Realization struck Graves with violent clarity. The stakes were rising. Montgomery's work was fatal, and he was on the precipice of the storm. He moved swiftly, securing the room and ensuring Lang's demise would not be in vain. Somewhere within these pages lay a truth that could rewrite the script of power. Graves spent the night scanning the pages against the looming threat of hurried footsteps. As dawn broke, casting fragile light against the Gothic arches, Graves discerned a fragment of Montgomery's dauntless narrative. Her work was indeed a tempest, a disruption echoing beneath the watchful, cultured Ivy League facade. The battle lines were drawn. Graves now stood amid a conspiracy, not simply a murder, but a rebellion against constructed history. He resolved to expose this deceit. If Montgomery's brilliance had cost her life, Graves would ensure the sacrifice would not be for nothing. He steeled himself against the morning chill. A confrontation awaited, a final act unspooling amidst Yale's walls. As the university came to life, oblivious yet complicit, Graves armed himself with Montgomery's truth, ready to resurrect her voice against the shadows plotting within those venerable spires. Chapter 6. The Final Act. The Great Hall of Yale truly was a theatre that morning, students and faculty filling the grand space with resonant footsteps and murmurs. The echoes spoke of routine, of life carrying on, yet underneath, a sinister undercurrent pulsed, the wake of Simon Lang's murder now lingering uneasily amidst the hallowed stones. Detective Graves stood silently at the fringes, the burden of the revelation weighing heavily. He'd commandeered a small auditorium meeting, gathering the key players, Dr. Adrian Sinclair, Mona Carter, and a shadowy cohort of lesser academics. They were all pivot points in this narrative, a mesh of allegiances and secrets. Sinclair, ever the composed gentleman, maintained his veneer of control. Mona sat closer to the edge, apprehension threatening to spill over her carefully constructed demeanor. The others were uncertain, eyes flicking between the detective and the icons of authority around them. Graves began, his voice firm and unwavering.
We meet under somber circumstances. Elara Montgomery's death is more than a personal tragedy. It's a battle cry against a centuries-old deception within academia's ivory towers.
There was a hushed silence, the room thick with tension and the piqued interest of brittle alliances.
I've uncovered the framework of Dr. Montgomery's research. It points to a subtext that not only interprets Shakespeare anew, but demands an upheaval.
Sinclair interjected, his voice a rich baritone of skepticism.
Detective, this is highly irregular to suggest our institution allows such subversion.
Graves cut in, eyes narrowing.
It speaks volumes that you know the stakes, Dr. Sinclair. But these aren't merely academic provocations. Simon Lang paid for aiding Montgomery with his life, and this very room bears the weight of that blood.
The accusation hung, a leaden testament to the room's mood. Mona shifted, voices murmuring in hushed disbelief.
You're implying...
Murder, Graves confirmed.
To hide a truth bent on distorting foundations. As surely as betrayal, your illusions, Dr. Sinclair, to protect your own legacy, ended in complicity.
Eyes widened, confusion and anger lighting the air like a tempest.
In Montgomery's research lay threads threatening the power equilibrium.
Graves elaborated.
Her findings, they would have redirected funding, redefined roles, rocked what you treasure as sacred. Think, detective. I am not the villain you wish me to be.
He returned.
This is academia, a place for discourse debate.
Graves held up a page from Montgomery's notes, now marked with blood.
This blood speaks of betrayal and deceit.
Sinclair deflated, shoulders slumping. He was caught, exposed. It was no longer about intimate disagreement, but mortal consequences. Mona finally spoke, her voice laced with awe-tinged dread.
But this is all because of Elara's brilliant madness, isn't it? She believed so fiercely.
Graves nodded, seeing in Mona the torchbearer Montgomery needed.
And together we can resurrect her voice for justice.
As the assembly began to disband with renewed gravity, Graves sensed he'd steered them from darkness into the probing light. It was over. Roots were being unearthed, and as the room emptied, Graves felt Montgomery's spectre departing, her legacy passed to new generations. Through the waiting investigators, Yale's Great Hall stood silent, its Gothic spires marking time as they bore witness to untold chapters. Standing amidst it, Lionel Graves understood that sometimes the truth was worth every sacrifice. Shadows had rippled, secrets unraveled, and knowledge transcended. Montgomery's Ivy League enigma now marked Dawn's resolve, an academic resurrection beyond the confines of a single life.